I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
You are listening to the Moderate Rebels podcast with Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton. Today we are joined by an amazing guest who is one of the leading reporters on the Middle East. He's been a correspondent from the region for decades, and he is one of the key writers for The Independent, the British newspaper. We are with Patrick Cockburn, and Max and I have the privilege of picking his brain and discussing what's been happening, not just in Syria, but also in Iraq. In fact, he just got back from the region. So today we'll be discussing several battles, some of which already happened and some of which are still going on. We'll talk about the battle for Eastern Ghouta near Damascus, where the Syrian government is fighting Islamist extremists armed by Saudi Arabia. We'll also talk about a battle that's getting much less media attention, and that is in northern Syria in the city of Afrin, where Turkey invaded northern Syria in alliance with extremist Islamist rebels and has carried out war crimes in the Kurdish majority community of Afrin. Salafi rebels have looted and razed the area, burning down Kurdish homes. And of course, because Turkey's a NATO ally, and because not just the US, but also Russia implicitly gave Turkey the green light to invade, it hasn't gotten very much coverage in corporate media, especially compared to Eastern Ghouta. We'll also be talking about several other battles in Syria, including the battles for Aleppo, Raqqa, and Idlib, and in Iraq, the battle for Mosul. Patrick Cockburn has reported on all of these conflicts for the past several years, and he's traveled extensively through the region, so he's a wealth of knowledge on all of this. And I know Max and I learned a lot in this episode as well. Also, toward the end, we have a discussion about just how bad the media reporting in the corporate media has been on Syria and Iraq. And Patrick Cockburn even said that after decades of reporting from the Middle East, he thinks the Western media reporting on Syria is probably the worst and most biased reporting he's seen. So this is a great episode for dispelling a lot of the propaganda and misleading talking points on the war in Syria.
Yeah, Patrick, first of all, great to have you here. I guess we should just start generally, I think, and just ask you, where were you and what did you see on the ground?
I was in northern Syria. Well, first of all, let me say thanks very much for inviting me. I was in northern Syria, which is kind of complicated to get to. So I flew to Baghdad and then got a plane up to Erbil, which is the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. And the reason for this is because of the confrontation between the central government in Baghdad and the Kurds last October, and the Iraqi government went and seized Kirkuk. There are no international flights to Iraqi Kurdistan. They're starting up again, but they weren't at that moment. So then I got permission, had to wait some days to get permission to cross over the Tigris River into eastern Syria, which there is a bridge, but for some reason they don't use it. So you have to cross it in a rather sort of unwieldy metal boat, and then move into Kurdish-controlled northern Syria, which is a big chunk of the country. This is about 25% of Syria. And I went first to a city called their capital, Qamishli, and then moved west, drive about 5 or 6 hours. Distances are very large there through the plains, sort of wheat fields, and the oil industry there, which is only partly working. And then I wanted to get close to Afrin, near to Aleppo, to limits of the Kurdish-controlled area. The reason being that, to my mind, the war in Syria is being transformed, that Assad against the Syrian opposition is running down. Eastern Ghouta is on the edge of falling. Assad is getting control of all of Damascus for the first time of 2012. But a new war is opening up between the Kurds and the Turks. It's not getting so much reporting, but the Turks, as you'll have seen, have surrounded the city of Afrin, this Kurdish enclave. There are 400,000 people there, and we're seeing scenes very similar to Eastern Ghouta taking place there, of people being bombarded, being killed, trying to flee. Although, again, there's a sort of disparity in the reporting between what happens in Afrin and what happens in Ghouta.
Yeah. You outlined that disparity in a piece for The Independent, kind of contrasting the Western reaction to Mosul and Aleppo. In Aleppo, you had Western proxies occupying 5 districts of eastern Aleppo. In Mosul, you had the U.S. and its partners on the ground basically leveling a city. So the reaction was different. And now we see Western and Gulf proxies being winkled out of Eastern Ghouta by the Syrian forces, and a complete freak out in the West. Meanwhile, Afrin is being leveled by a NATO partner in Turkey, and the West and Western media is kind of, I would say, underreporting, to put it lightly. Maybe you want to. Do you see the same parallels between Mosul and Aleppo and Afrin and Eastern Ghouta?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be careful in Syria and Iraq using the word proxy. These guys in Eastern Ghouta, Jaish al-Islam was traditionally paid by Saudi Arabia, but, there is a real opposition as well. The, proxies are never under the total control of their sponsors, but almost all factions are getting their money and weapons and ammunition from somewhere or other. Yeah, I find it, it's been the pattern of the war there that you are very skewed reporting. And one aspect of this is, one thing we've seen in Iraq and Syria is sieges. It's been a war of sieges. There's a siege of Raqqa, there's a siege of Mosul, of East Aleppo, of Fallujah, Ramadi, you name it. But completely different type of reporting. So East Aleppo, very extensive reporting, focusing on civilian suffering. Mosul, much less, though I'm quite convinced the casualties are much higher.
In fact, you wrote an article for The Independent about the sieges, and you said quite explicitly that Mosul probably was the bloodiest of all of these sieges.
Oh, I'm sure it was, yeah, because particularly on the West Bank, this is a city of 2 million people, or used to be. You had Daesh, ISIS wasn't letting people out, and people were confined in a more and more limited area. Maybe you had 70 people in a house. And airstrikes were coming in, and artillery. People always focus on airstrikes, but there's plenty of artillery as well, and rockets coming in. And these areas were devastated. Now, during the siege last year, I found that you could actually, ISIS, you may remember, stop people using, or attempted to stop people using mobile phones and chop their heads off and hang them if they did. And they'd also blew up the mobile towers. But when East Mosul fell to the Iraqi army, they put up some towers, and ISIS had other things on their mind. So I could talk to people inside the ISIS enclave. And what struck, and they were having an appalling time. They were running out of food, they were desperate to escape, etc. But the point I want to make is that all the people I talked to were killed, and most of their extended families, because when the siege finally ended, I tried to find them, and I found they were all dead. So, there's very strong evidence of enormous civilian casualties. You may have seen a report, a very extensive report, actually, in the New York Times. It didn't seem to make quite the splash it might have, of that in one area south of Mosul called Kayara, which I know, the U.S. Air Force had said they'd killed 1 civilian. Real figure was 43 civilians. The U.S. Air Force said, I think, that 1 in 157 of their airstrikes led to a civilian casualties or civilian death, and the real figure was 1 in 5. So I think that there were horrific civilian casualties there, which really didn't get much attention.
And you wrote an article in July, an incredible article, in which Kurdish intelligence officials told you that they estimated 40,000 civilians. That is 40,000. That's 10 times larger than many of the estimates died in the battle for Mosul.
This is what they said, and that's what I reported. The answer is I don't know it was 40,000, but I'm quite sure it was much larger than other people than others were reporting at the time. And, the figures have been creeping up as to how many people were there. But, there's still bodies under the rubble there that they're digging out at the moment. But there was you could sense throughout this, there was a sort of desire to play down the destructiveness of what was happening. You say all these sieges are a bit the same, whether they're by the Syrian army or the Iraqi army, that these armies aren't that big, so they don't want to take casualties. So basically they stand off and blow the place up. Now, the US-led coalition says they're terribly careful, but I was just in Raqqa 10 days ago, and you walk down the street and everything is destroyed. This precision bombing, it looks exactly like pictures of, Hamburg or Dresden in the Second World War. Everything is gone.
And is there, I mean, what's the situation for people in Raqqa? Are they able to get social services? I saw a few months ago that some of the villages in the Raqqa, outlying district, and this is a Sunni Arab population, are unable to reconnect to the central government, so they're lacking electricity, and the U.S. is sort of preventing them from reconnecting. RT has had pretty good access to Raqqa over the last few months, and they've been reporting that people who are internally displaced can't return to their homes. And meanwhile, you do see in Aleppo that there is rebuilding and people are coming back. So what did you see there?
Well, they say there are 150,000 people back. I couldn't see them. They may have been on the sort of outskirts of the city, but the population of Raqqa used to be very much so concentrated in the center. There isn't electricity. There isn't aid because there's a lot of mines, IEDs left behind. The UN says they can't find sort of points at which to distribute aid, which are safe. It's a very sort of melancholy, sort of traumatized place. You see, the first person I saw when I got into Raqqa was an old woman who was 80 years old, scrabbling in the sort of the debris from some airstrike, looking for pieces of plastic and metal to sell. And she said that one of her sons had been killed by an IED, and she was trying to feed the wife and daughter. So that's sort of pretty typical of the situation there. And it doesn't seem to be getting much better. They kind of swept the main streets for the rubbish, but otherwise you're surrounded by all these sort of broken concrete and reinforcement bars in different sort of shapes. And somebody came and showed me there's one working traffic light. Nobody quite knows why it's working in the center of Raqqa. But otherwise it's devastation.
I spoke to a lobbyist for the Kurdistan Regional Authority here in Washington a few months before the operation in Raqqa began, and asked him, what's going to happen to the population there? Because as you mentioned, these are sieges, and people become either displaced or massive amounts of civilians get killed. He said they will decamp, and what he meant was that they will be supplanted by the Sunni Arab population will be substantially supplanted by Kurdish population brought in by the SDF. Do you see that happening anywhere?
No, I don't actually. But it's I'm glad you brought up, it's kind of typical of the sort of paranoia in the area. It won't happen because the Euphrates Valley, Raqqa, is very, very few Kurds there. And you couldn't bring Kurds in. Where would you bring them from? And they'd be too frightened to stay, Right. It would be very dangerous for them. So, just sort of resettlement of another population is sort of difficult in Syria because, they don't want to get shot. Right. But lots of people are full of fear, that they're going to be supplanted. This is true in Eastern Ghouta, it's true in Afrin. And sometimes, it may have substance in Afrin, which is, a core Kurdish area. Erdogan suddenly, the Turkish president, announced just after the invasion on 20th of January, that he discovered that the population was 55% Arab, and the Kurds shouldn't be there anyway. And also Turkish officials have been talking about, they have 3.5 million refugees or something.
Right.
Now, there is in some areas there is a threat of this, and it goes up and down from area to area. but people are frightened, that there's going to be sectarian or ethnic cleansing, or people are already being cleansed, somebody will come in.
On that note, let's talk more about Afrin. You published an article in which a former ISIS official told you that Turkey, in its invasion of Afrin, which began in January, has been training former ISIS fighters to attack the Kurdish forces from the YPG, the People's Protection Units. And then, of course, we've seen video in your article, and that was also on social media, in which some extremists, some Salafi jihadists from the Free Syrian Army, which at this point is embedded within the Turkish army, were chanting messages in support of the militants in Chechnya. Also, they mentioned Tora Bora and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan under the leadership of Osama bin Laden. So we've clearly seen that Turkey in these past few years has supported extremist Islamist groups, but in this case, they're actually embedded within the Turkish army. Can you talk more about the nature of the Turkish forces and the fact that, like you said, Erdogan and other members of his administration, which have become very nationalistic and have been using a lot of this anti-Kurdish rhetoric, there is a discussion that they may try to ethnically cleanse Kurdish civilians from the area in northern Syria, or engage in large population transfer and move many refugees into this area to try to forcibly change the demographics of and Arabize the area.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strong possibility of this, but you don't have to. You talk about ethnic cleansing, one has the idea of, people going door to door, soldiers going to door to door and kicking people out. But if you have these sort of videos, you mentioned one there's another one of these so-called Free Syrian Army people, but they're using the sort of vocabulary of Daesh, of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, saying, the infidel Kurds must convert. The Kurds are Sunni Muslims. Well, convert to what? Well, to, the ISIS brand of Islam.
Which is the Saudi brand, Wahhabism.
Yeah. If people are watching this on television, with their families, it's a bit difficult to do at the moment because they've destroyed the Wi-Fi tower in Afrin, but people would have seen that before or heard of it. This is pretty terrifying that ISIS is coming around the block and considers you an infidel and is openly threatening to chop your head off. So you don't, if you want ethnic cleansing or sectarian cleansing, people are going to flee. They're already fleeing. And they're looking at pictures today of people, on their tractors and everything else crammed into vehicles trying to get out. I think about 40,000 of them got out today.
And for listeners, today is March 16th.
So, in a sense, sectarian cleansing is already happening. Will these people be able to get back? Well, many years ago, sort of start of journalistic career, I was in Cyprus, which Turkey invaded in 1974, and the Greeks were driven to the southern side of the island and lost their houses. And they're still there, at the time people talked about them coming back in a few days. But however many decades it is later, they are still expelled. So the same thing could happen in Afrin. And there's a suspicion that Turkey wants to sort of build up a Sunni Arab sort of bloc under its influence in that area, which will make it a sort of continual player inside Syria.
And how does Afrin connect to Idlib? Turkey's obviously setting up a little statelet in Idlib, and if it's able to recapture or capture Afrin, it has, pretty much.
It's influential on these, though their supply lines depend on Turkey. How much they're wholly controlled by Turkey is a slightly different question in Idlib. But, these are the people who control it are former al-Nusra, effectively al-Qaeda.
I see these Turkish convoys go through Idlib, and it looks like, a Shriners parade of al-Qaeda. You got the you got the al-Qaeda fighters lining up, cheering for these Turkish convoys rolling through. And I have to conclude that there's some sort of friendly relationship there. You got Turkey controlling the borders. Turkish books are actually being used in religious education. So it's clear that Turkey is seeking long-term occupation of Idlib and Afrin. My question is, how important is Afrin to to consolidating its control of Idlib?
Well, it gives it control of that area. There's a sort of area north of Aleppo. It's very sort of fertile when you look at it. It doesn't sort of look like what we will imagine the Middle East to look like. It's a sort of kind of Mediterranean landscape with lots of sort of olive trees and fertile. So the population's pretty high, and they're mostly Sunni Arabs, apart from this big Kurdish enclave. So that gives them control of a big area north and west of Aleppo, which, partly under direct control, partly under indirect control in Idlib. And so this puts them in quite a strong position. Then, but their ultimate objective would be to destroy this sort of quasi de facto Kurdish state that's grown up east of the Euphrates with U.S. air support since 2000 and the end of 2014. But, we seem to be, that's why I was talking about a new sort of phase in the war or wars in Syria, that what the Turks are doing now seems to be the first phase in this of a conflict that's going to go on and on.
Well, on this note, I think it's actually a good point to discuss what the U.S. role has been in this, because I think it's shifted in a few ways. So clearly, when ISIS was still in control of significant parts of Syria, the U.S. decided that it would be strategic to ally with the Kurdish majority YPG forces, which rebranded essentially. Of course, the SDF is not entirely the YPG, but the YPG leads it. It looked from outside, it looked like the U.S. strategy was to try to use these forces to try to impose a kind of Balkanization of Syria and create this Kurdish state. At this point, it looks like that's not going to happen. I mean, I think it's very implausible, especially after the Iraqi referendum, after the split between the Barzani and Talabani faction in northern Iraq and the Kurdish forces who supported the Iraqi central government retaking Kirkuk. So it looks like the U.S., if the U.S. did have this plan, which looked likely at Balkanizing Syria, I don't think that's really in the cards anymore. So the question is, what is going to happen with the YPG? We saw that in late January, when Turkey invaded northern Syria, the YPG requested assistance from the Syrian government, and the Syrian government sent in National Defense Forces, the NDF, which are pro-government allied militias who have been fighting against Turkey in alliance with the YPG. So we see this kind of sudden shift in the alliances where the YPG is now leaning back toward the Syrian government in opposition to Turkey. Do you think that these alliances are in flux, or is my analysis missing a key point?
Yeah, I think, before 2014, the U.S. was sort of famously looking for allies on the ground in Syria. And, this ended up not only in sort of failure, but pretty well sort of comical failure. And what was it that at one point they'd spent $500 million and managed to recruit 3 people?
5 or 6, yeah.
At the end of 2014, during the siege of Kobani by ISIS and YPG, the Kurds were fighting, the People's Protection Units. YPG were fighting very hard. And then I think it was in October 2014, the U.S. Started air support. And that was a sort of this rather strange alliance with the YPG, which is, sort of left-wing, in many ways similar to a sort of communist party, although it wouldn't say that.
Yes, it's strongly socialist in orientation and very ideologically leftist. But
very effective militarily and backed by U.S. air power. They've sort of taken this area, which is about 25%, quite a quarter of Syria. They're actually, let me say, one often sees on newspaper and television these sort of neat little maps, and people saying, at one point they were saying that, Assad only controlled 36%, and then it was 47%. It's a sort of nonsense, this, because a lot of Syria is arid, is desert or semi-desert. So the actual number of square miles you hold is not very relevant. It's populated areas that can.
Well, this is true for Yemen as well, where they take the percentage of the area. But if you looked at Syria, the Syrian government always controlled the majority of the populated areas. It only ever lost 3 provincial capitals. And similarly in Yemen, the Houthi movement, which was in alliance with Salah, they control 80% of the populated areas. But when you look at a map, it looks like a smaller area because, like you said, a lot of this area that is controlled by, in the case of Syria, ISIS, or in the case of the southern government in Yemen, this is empty area where few people live.
Sure, yeah. The current population in Syria is probably around 16 million. It was about 23 million in 2011. And probably about 12 million of those people are in areas that are ruled by Assad. Kurds, probably about 2 million. The opposition in Idlib and elsewhere, probably a bit below 2 million. But just going back to what happened there with the U.S. So the U.S. came in, used the Air Force, destruction of Raqqa, advanced, sort of defeated ISIS. But now, the Kurds have always known this when ISIS was going to be defeated. Was the U.S. going to continue to support them? Was it going to continue a quarrel with Turkey? I'm not so sure. You see, it seems to me from January, since Rex Tillerson, the former Secretary of State, made a statement, this rather weird statement, saying the U.S. suddenly announced the U.S. was going to stay in Syria and it was going to do loads of things like combating Iranian influence, it wanted to get rid of Assad and so forth. Things it really wasn't up to doing. But this sort of, I think, ignited real anger in Turkey and in Moscow. And it seemed to have sort of precipitated the invasion of Afrin. I think that the U.S. there, if they want to play any role in Syria, which they clearly do, then they still need a ground force. And the only available ground force are the Syrian Kurds. Otherwise, they have to sort of just basically say, Assad and the Russians have won, we've lost, which they don't look like saying. So I'm not so sure. I think they're not doing anything over Afrin, but they said they never would. There's another city called Manbij, which is sort of the next big city east. It's an Arab city, which is going to be the next sort of topic of dispute between the U.S. and Turkey.
Yeah, the commander of CENTCOM, General Joseph Vodal, has just said that the U.S. will not leave Manbij and has set up sort of a safe zone there. And it appears, and we also saw today, CNN and the mainstream networks are colossally misreporting it, somewhat willfully, saying a U.S. helicopter crashed in Iraq, engaged in troop movements, but the helicopter was taking troops into Syria, and it seems like the networks don't really want to discuss the fact that the U.S. has illegally invaded Syria. Clearly, the next phase of the war is between the great powers. How much, to what extent is Manbij kind of a bulwark of U.S. occupation and continuation of the Balkanization strategy that Ben mentioned, and how and can the U.S. hold on, considering how badly it just burned the Kurds? Can it hold on to that alliance?
Well, Manbij is a kind of weird city, but it's an Arab city, about 300,000, a big hinterland, maybe 700,000 altogether. And now the Kurds were meant to withdraw from it, said they had, but withdrawals and advances in Syria often mean people just change out of one uniform, and into another.
Yeah.
When it comes to ISIS, Daesh, often, it's a quick shave of the beard and maybe another uniform or maybe not, and announce, that ISIS has left. So when you sort of go, I was in the front line, it's actually just north of Manbij city, sort of pretty inactive. You could see sort of Turkish troops, just not so far away, but everybody seemed to be standing upright. Nobody seemed to be expecting anybody to shoot at them. Now, front lines often are like that, and sort of 10 minutes later, things start happening. But it doesn't look like that yet. What you do see is a lot of U.S. armored vehicles on the road. The U.S. has sort of headquarters in a big cement factory just on the other side of the Euphrates. And you see these sort of 5-6 armored vehicles with big stars and stripes on the road. They don't really go into the city. They go around it and the front lines are showing the flag against the Turks. So I'm just doubtful that the U.S. is really going to withdraw from there, because then they probably feel that, that things will begin to crumble.
Yeah.
They also kind of need, at a certain moment, if the Kurds feel the U.S. isn't going to defend them, then they have to look to the government in Damascus and the Russians to do that. They won't want to do that. The Russians won't want to do that because they will want to keep Turkey on side. One of their big gains in this war has been, their new alliance or close relations with Turkey. But, the Kurds are in this position that they don't want to keep the U.S. on board. They don't want to offend Assad too much.
They're Syrians, after all.
Yeah, they're Syrians, but also, Syria is full of people who don't like anybody very much, but they're really frightened of one bunch more than they are than the other. If you're in Damascus, you find people who are very pro-Assad, and then you find a much bigger group of people who don't much like Assad, but they're really terrified of the alternative. This has been one of the great misselling of the Syrian war and of the failure of the so-called Syrians or liberal opposition or non-jihadi opposition, is they kind of pretended they were in control. But the most important political fact was that if, first of all, you're in a minority or an Alawite or a Christian or something, you're either a dead duck or a refugee if the other side wins. But also a lot of Sunni feel the same way, that the alternative is ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And you can see the way in Syria, there's no minority fleeing into an opposition area. When they flee, they always flee into government areas.
Our friend Rania Khalek, who has been in Damascus, who's been around Syria.
She also has family in Syria. She has family in the south. She's Druze.
Who has family in Sweda, who, fear ethnic cleansing justifiably from the moderate rebels. She said that the population in Damascus is actually disappointed at the government's response to East Ghouta because it hasn't been hard enough. They're so sick of living so close to Jaish al-Islam, Arar al-Sham, and al-Nusra that they'd be happy to see the place be even leveled. They're sick of being shelled constantly. They're sick of taking casualties. We've seen video of the quote-unquote moderate rebels in Eastern Ghouta actually firing on civilian airliners.
Yeah, and parading Alawite women in cages as human shields.
What do you make of this analysis? It's obviously not one that I endorse, but it's what we're hearing from the ground.
It's when I'm in Damascus, I normally stay in an area called Bab Tuma, which is a Christian area in the old city, because it's kind of safer because no Christian's going to be a member of ISIS, of Daesh, and mortar bombs are coming over, probably not anything like the kind of bombardment going into Eastern Ghouta, but it's killing quite a lot of people. So you don't, if somebody is firing mortar bombs with the general intention of killing you, you really don't feel too good about them. And if that goes on for years and years, when your children are going to school, you sort of probably want to wipe them out. But that's, been a situation for years. This is a genuine civil war. So you have that feeling. And also, you see on the government side, you'll have a lot of people whose, sons have been killed in the war and so forth. So you'll have that feeling.
It's just not widely understood here in the West that there's this urgency in Damascus to get back to normal life and to see law and order restored after so many years. And now there's this opportunity to do so.
Well, also on that note, you mentioned the soldiers who have been killed from the Syrian army, Patrick, and we saw a recent report from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is, there are issues with it. This is an explicitly pro-opposition group. It's mostly run by one guy, Rami Abdulrahman, based in the UK and England, Coventry. But at the same time, this is a mainstream opposition or mainstream monitoring group that is regularly quoted by media. And a recent report said that approximately 350,000 Syrians have been killed in this horrific war. But what was surprising about the report is it shows that the casualties are split roughly evenly into three groups. So about 35% of those killed have been rebel fighters from a variety of groups, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other groups. Another, about an equal number, about 120,000 people, 35% or so of the total deaths, have also been from pro-government forces. And we've actually heard very little about them because in a lot of Western media reporting, because the Syrian army has an air force, and because the rebels do not have an air force, although they've received air support in some cases, there's been this presentation of the conflict as if it's one-sided. But this report is striking because it shows that 60,000 Syrian army soldiers have been killed, and then another 60,000 pro-government forces have been killed. And of course, the Syrian army is based on conscription. So what's interesting is why don't we hear the stories of these average Syrians, many of whom are also Sunni, they're not just from other minority groups. They have died in the tens of thousands, but that's almost never acknowledged.
Yeah, that's quite right. I've often noticed this in the casualty figures that the Syrian Observatory puts out. And it's one of the sort of, although it's kind of pro-opposition in a certain sense, It tries to be objective. Actually, they've been going on about, the guy who runs it, Rami Abdul Rahman, was been going on about people should pay more attention to Afrin and not just go on and on about Eastern Ghouta. But, there's an argument that often comes up, that the Syrian army was never fighting ISIS, but this is directly contradicted by the fact that they suffer very heavy casualties. The sort of opposition argument, there is no Syrian army, it's all those Russians and the Iranians, and Iraqi Shia militia and so forth. But it's also nonsense. When people actually did studies, they showed that actually people who were mostly fighting ISIS were, in fact, the Syrian army, followed by the Kurds. But it's one of these sort of gobbets of propaganda that sort of took off and is repeated endlessly, though it's actually quite easy to prove it's untrue. It's typical of the general reporting of the Syrian war, I'm afraid, and actually it was of the Libyan war as well, that the government side is only reported in terms of its crimes. And these may be real crimes, but if at the same time you never report things, that there are quite a lot of people who are in favor of the government, and you never report the crimes of the opposition, you're basically producing propaganda. It's a completely skewed view. So when you have these pictures and videos from Eastern Ghouta of the bombardment of civilian areas, of dead and dying children in hospital, that, I think is probably all true. But if at the same time you exclude ever showing a single armed man, and there are meant to be 10,000 fighters then, people get a completely skewed view of what's going on there. And that's really been the pattern since 2011, to my mind.
Well, and on that note, it's interesting. Let's talk a bit more about the situation in Eastern Ghouta, because a lot of people don't understand, as you just acknowledged. In fact, Bassem Marou, who's a pretty good reporter for Associated Press and has been producing several excellent reports on Eastern Ghouta, he said that there are more than 20,000 armed rebels in Eastern Ghouta. So like you said, we hear the presentation of this conflict as a very one-sided direction. There's no question that many civilians have been killed by the Syrian military bombing. This is a densely populated area. There's no question that war crimes have been committed. But why don't we hear about the fact that there are 20,000 armed fighters? We're talking about a very significant apparatus consisting of 10,000 from Jaish al-Islam, 8,000 from Falak al-Rahman, and then 2,000 from a variety of other groups, including several hundred al-Qaeda fighters.
Yeah, I'm pretty dubious about figures, from a sort of chaotic, war-torn area, but let's take that as sort of true. Another point about the reporting, which again I think has distorted it during the war, is that you have people who, maybe wholly sincerely are sympathetic to the Syrian armed opposition, and imply in their reporting that it would be a good thing if Assad fell and that opposition took over. But they don't ever go, or practically never go, to areas controlled by the opposition. And the reason is very clear, that opposition would would immediately kidnap them and or kill them. So on the one hand, you have people, this reporting from abroad, from Beirut, from Gaziantep, just north of in Turkey, north of the Syrian border, in Istanbul, basically backing the opposition as the alternative, and they would be the only alternative to Assad. But they don't dare go to those areas because they'd get murdered. What are they going to do to an Alawite or a Christian or a Druze or anybody else they don't like if they got into the center of Damascus?
Right. Gaziantep is also known as Spooksville over here. Pretty much anyone who wants to do a favorable report on the rebels, meet some opposition activists, go on a regime change fishing expedition, they wind up in Gaziantep. And that's where we see so many bylines from, whether it's Liz Sly or any of the blue check marks. And
I'm not going to criticize any of the particular ones, but partly because when I'm in the area, I don't actually see some of the stuff.
I'm speaking for myself, and I am so. but
I do think that it's, if you're there, there's always something pretty absurd to my mind. If you're reporting from Gaziantep or Istanbul, and sometimes you have people, and you have lots of academic experts who haven't set foot in Syria for years. If they have, it's been one toe over the border. And yet, are completely categorical about what's going on there.
Yeah.
What would we say about somebody, in Britain who was reporting on the US election, the midterm elections, and then, during a broadcast said, they hadn't been to America and they hadn't been there for years. They'd immediately discredit themselves. But again and again, in Syria, and the same is true of Iraq, you have people who haven't been to these places sounding off, joining up dots which shouldn't be joined up, and often dots that aren't there in the first place, and not knowing about others, but it's sort of, there's a lot of this is very obvious why these are not responsible sources of information about what's going on in these places.
Yeah, I think that really leads us to one of the worst phenomenons that I've witnessed during this civil war, which is the reliance by mainstream Western reporters in the United States and in the UK in particular on what they call opposition activists, or just simply activists, who are often people who are equipped with communications gear, cameras, sat phones, etc., supplied by the State Department and the UK Foreign Office. The white helmets are a key source of information, and it papers over what's actually happening on the ground. They conceive these messaging campaigns through PR groups like the Syria campaign. They deploy children who clearly can't speak English from Bana Alabed to Mohammed Najim in Eastern Ghouta to deliver these appeals to the West for military intervention. And it's all rolled into or laundered behind legitimate journalism in mainstream papers. And then, one of the messaging campaigns that we've been witnessing out of Eastern Ghouta that I find to be really dubious, and I want to get your opinion on it. It really emanates from an organization called the Syrian American Medical Society, which has been funded to the tune of at least $500,000 by USAID under the auspices of the State Department. It's based in suburban Chicago, which is the home of the Syrian exile community, basically, the analog to the Miami Cubans. And they have been alleging, at least for the past 2 years, that there are just consistent chlorine attacks on rebel-held areas. And to prove it, they'll produce a photograph of some person in a hospital with an oxygen mask on. And that's their proof. And now, since the Yulia Skripal poisoning in England, we've seen an effort to connect these dubious reports of chlorine attacks to what is said to be a Russian nerve agent terror attack in the heart of England. So first, I guess I would want to ask you, what do you think? What do you make of all of this sourcing, and do you see any legitimacy to the claims of chlorine attacks by the Syrian army in Eastern Ghouta?
Well, the answer is I don't know. But, what's wrong with all these things is an extremely simple thing. It's secondhand reporting, citing sources that are known to be partisan. One shouldn't have to think about this for more than about 3 seconds, that these are dubious sources and they are secondhand. You see, there's another thing that once you have, areas that journalists can't go into, and if they then basically hand over the reporting to those guys who are in charge of that area, or people who will license local people to produce reports, you actually give an incentive for people in control of these areas to exclude journalists or kill them if they come, because, that's going to queer your pitch. So, I find it pretty amazing that this stuff, some of it probably true, some of it probably untrue, but it all comes from secondhand partisan sources. And that's never pointed out. One television thing I was watching of the sort of the guy in the studio, in this case in London, said we don't have a reporter there because it's dangerous. Sort of vaguely implying that, this is danger because of shells and so forth, but not saying it's dangerous because the guys who run this place will kill us if we go there. So I think that's, that I haven't quite seen that. All wars mean propaganda, but a war so dominated by propaganda as this one, partly because communications have got a lot better and partly because governments are funding this sort of thing, I don't think it's ever been quite this bad before.
You're saying that the reporting that you've witnessed out of Syria from the Western media is the worst reporting you've ever witnessed. Is that what you're saying?
I think so, yeah. A contender is Libya. I was in Libya and Benghazi and Tripoli in 2011, and it was getting bad then. You'd have stories served up. One example is, I don't know if you remember it, there was a story, a woman said she had conducted a survey of women in eastern Libya. She distributed, I think she said 70,000 questionnaires. This was in the middle of a war. She'd got 60,000 returned. You don't even get that in, Hyde Park. And she was amazed to discover that she gave a very precise figure, which I can't remember, but let's say it was 237 or something. These women said they'd been raped by Gaddafi's soldiers, and then that this was part of soldiers had been ordered to rape women.
And given Viagra.
Yeah, they were given Viagra, lots of things. She didn't say that. I mean, that was a slightly separate story. But there was systematic rape. Now, this was covered by everybody. This was demonized Gaddafi. It was a major sort of reason for getting rid of him. Now, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN all conducted surveys into this woman's story, and all concluded, without exception, that there was absolutely no evidence it was true. But of course, by that time, the story had run for a couple of weeks. These reports take, 3 or 4 weeks to produce. Nobody noticed.
Yeah.
They said, this woman could not produce any of the questionnaires she'd sent out. They asked to meet anybody she said she'd interviewed and who said they'd been raped. She couldn't do that, So it became very evident to them that this is all a fabrication.
Well, you got to look at the bigger picture. I mean, women are doing so much better in Libya, aren't they? I mean, it's a feminist paradise.
It's pretty obvious, Again, it was sort of, you don't have to be much of a reporter to figure out. I remember going to the front line south of Benghazi, and there were some, militiamen hanging around, but there were more reporters than militiamen. So the cameraman would ask the journalists to move out of the way so they could get a shot of, some of these guys in their truck, standing proud in their truck with their heavy machine gun, with all the other journalists sort of moving to one side. And, these guys weren't going to conquer anything without being, NATO basically conducting the war. So, again, this should have been pretty obvious. I remember also, that when I think the head of the first provisional government came into, at the end of 2011, after the death of Gaddafi, came into Tripoli, the first thing they did was to rescind his ban on polygamy. It kind of told you where these guys were coming from.
Right.
So, there are many other things like that. So this tremendous sort of propaganda onslaught, partly one suspects orchestrated by, foreign organizations or intelligence organizations, very heavily funded sort of, and that you won't always seen that before, but it was much more accomplished in Libya and even more effective in Syria.
And you've been a target of it. I mean, you've come under an enormous attack.
I get attacked. There's a war on, you kind of got to expect to be attacked. The guys on one side. Let's say they're all terrifically decent folk. They still think, why are you supporting? They'll say, why are you supporting Assad? It's one of the things. Leaving aside all the nasty reasons why people misreport. Good journalism, to my mind, if you produce explanation, people take it as justification. I remember in 2012 going from Beirut to Damascus. And in Beirut, I'd had a cup of coffee with a rather nice Syrian guy who'd fled the country, very anti-Assad, who's a film director. And I went to Damascus, and then I wrote some pieces saying that, and this was the end of 2012, I think, that Assad wasn't going to go for various reasons, that his support was strong enough, the army wasn't split, he had foreign support and so forth. These were very material reasons. Then I went back, going back to Lebanon, and when I got to the border, I switched from my Syrian to my Lebanese phone and switched on the Lebanese phone. And there was this guy called me immediately and was screaming down the phone, shame on you, shame on the Independent. Why don't you say that Assad is going, Why don't you say his leadership is split, But so you get a lot of that. But I think, you're going to cover wars, that's what you got to expect. And that's what you kind of got to ignore as well.
Even from your colleagues, I mean, that's what I wanted to ask you. Just another question I wanted to ask you is, the viciousness of the kind of international press corps, they just seem so wedded to seeing a regime change in Syria, and I've never seen anything like it. Even, during the invasion of Iraq and the aftermath of U.S. occupation, I personally have been, a target of personal attacks from figures who are occupying, positions as bureau chiefs in the Middle East. And I just don't understand it at this point, when it's staring you in the face that regime change is not possible, that the opposition is substantially dominated by right-wing death squads, and it would be an absolute catastrophe for Syria if you look back at Libya. Why are they so wedded to this project?
It kind of amazes me. And I know, some guys, it's just because, that's the line of their government or the institution they work for. But I don't know, it's still pretty weird. I mean, but you quite sort of reasonable people who still sort of present the Syrian opposition as sort of Paris 1789, storming the Bastille. This was kind of a sectarian war from the beginning, it's sort of, and we were talking earlier about, minorities, that some minorities, the Druze you mentioned, tried to stay neutral. Some of them tried to stay neutral. And then they found when the opposition invaded their areas, there were enforced conversions. One place where they resisted, 20 of them got killed, got murdered. So, the whole community had no option but to stick with Assad. A lot of them was doing that beforehand, but all of them ended up doing that just as a matter of personal survival.
Yeah.
This is fairly obvious. I also, one thing I find disappointing journalism, you'd think that some journalists just wanting to make their name, purely careerist motives, would want to do something which wasn't, sticking to the party line, producing, the same old stuff. Might, find a few sources that aren't partisan. And it is doable. There are good journalists who've done this. Suddenly it's not all negative. And you suddenly see somebody who hasn't made it to opposition, but they've been pretty active on the phone. They've got good informants who are not partisan, who know things. It is doable. And I wonder why the others don't do it. Because, as I said, from a purely careerist point of view, it might do them some good.
It really connects to the whole narrative of Russiagate, where there's just no room for heresy at all in the West at this point. And I notice a lot of peer pressure among the correspondents. When I see one of them produce a relatively fair report, his or her peers will come down on them on Twitter and just mob them and intimidate them. It's a terrifying time.
Yeah, you have this sort of, what do you have? You have this sort of herd instinct plus, you have, people talk about a witch hunt, but it is, it is sometimes the atmosphere of the witch craze in, what was it, the 16th and 17th centuries,
Yes.
Which was a very bad idea to suggest there were no witches, or even that a lot of people who you seem to be burning or torturing, weren't witches, because you get burnt or tortured yourself, so it becomes sort of self-fulfilling. I'm not quite sure. It seems to me it's got considerably worse. And this sort of, as I said, sort of tremendous herd instinct that's very close to a sort of a witch craze. There's a sort of hysterical, a rather dangerous element to it.
Well, this is also interesting because earlier you said that you think that the propaganda on Syria and the misreporting is potentially the worst you've ever seen compared to other conflicts. And I'm curious, you've been reporting from the Middle East since 1979, I believe. And in these past several decades, you've written several books on the war in Iraq, on Syria. Even, I believe your first book was on the Soviet Union. Compared to all of these other conflicts that you've covered, do you think that the reporting on Syria really is the worst, or are there past conflicts where you think there were comparable kind of PR campaigns and misreporting campaigns?
I think not so effective as this. You probably have to go back to the First World War, I think, in which, you had propaganda was so dominated the coverage so absolutely. Yeah, some of these things are, are true. But, as I said earlier, if you take an individual and write a piece listing just that individual's fault or just having negative things that people say about that person, it will be a distortion. If you say that about a country or a regime, even a very bad regime, if you just report only their crimes, if you don't report anything else about them, and you don't report anything negative about their opponents, this is a propaganda. This is not a picture of what's really happening. I've always thought this is pretty simple to understand. But I think probably there was more effort. I suspect there was more effort in Libya to win over public opinion, because it was in the aftermath of the Iraq War. People ought to have been more suspicious after, the whole WMD claims that Saddam had WMD all turned out to be fake and exaggerated or invented and so forth. But then we had exactly very much the same thing in Syria, and then in Libya, and then in Syria. It's a bit surprising that people weren't a bit more skeptical, or journalists weren't a bit more skeptical after that. It was all a bit cruder, WMD, but it was quite sort of difficult to tell people that at the time that there was no evidence about this. And I remember reading this dodgy dossier that Blair produced, which is really a disgrace. And I sort of made a journalistic mistake. I sort of read it and then read I can't remember if I read anything at all. Thought it was such rubbish, it won't have any effect. Of course, it had enormous effect,
And the Chilcot, I don't know if it's the Chilcot inquiry, which, was the British government's investigation of itself for basically fabricating a case for war and dragging the military and the British public into this quagmire. I don't know if it was the Chilcot report or another report where
the British House of Commons, the Foreign Affairs Committee, released a bipartisan report on the war in Libya. This was published in 2016, reviewing many of the lies that were spewed.
Right. And they also released a House of Commons report on Libya, which confirmed that many lies were used to drag to drag the British into that invasion as well. But I was just going to make a point about the Chilcot inquiry, which it's buried in there as a general being quoted. Maybe another report about the success of lassoing reporters into the propaganda campaign that was being run by the military intelligence apparatus, and just what a smashing success it was. And I think we have to kind of concede at this point that there isn't much distance between the international press corps covering these events and the intelligence services. And that's become increasingly clear in the U.S. as you see the networks staffing up with contributors who represent a who's who of intelligence community chiefs. And then they kind of also function on the side as producers, shaping coverage, shaping the narrative. But that's what I find particularly terrifying. Is this, I mean, assuming you agree with my analysis, is this kind of an unprecedented phenomenon?
Yeah, I wouldn't quite agree with it. I mean, certainly in Britain or the people I know, this may be sort of talking heads in Washington or London. Intelligence people are always treated with sort of respect as if they know anything, although everything about government policy would indicate that they haven't a clue what's happening most of the time. But it's not that, I think that I think very few journalists are spooks.
I'm not saying they're spooks, but I mean, you look at the echo chamber and right now this kind of droning, monotonous narrative that Corbyn dared question the intelligence services, and it's, reinforced across the board in British mainstream media on Fleet Street.
Yeah, but maybe that's true, but one could also say the same sort of thing was happening before the last general election. Didn't seem to have much effect,
Yeah.
The whole media had to convince themselves because of these, as you say, it's an echo chamber, that because of all these allegations that they'd been pumping out and so forth, that Corbyn was going to do badly, party was going to do badly, and they almost won the election. Right. So I also think it's a bit sort of pity, kind of discredits the media as well, this sort of rubbish. And I think it also makes it very difficult to have a sort of sensible policy. There are sort of sensible policies that might emerge, but you find nobody believes propaganda as much as the propagandists themselves. it was kind of amazing in Baghdad in 2003 that you'd have these sort of US officials who still said the only attacks are coming from the remnants of the Ba'ath Party, and they ended up believing all this stuff, until, the roof fell in. Suddenly they only controlled islands of territory in Iraq. That's another aspect we haven't really talked about this sort of propaganda. They end up by believing it. One thing about Syria is that as soon as you had a civil war in Syria, which was essentially, to my mind, sectarian, with other social discontents and other elements added into it, Iraqi politicians were saying to me, if this goes on in Syria any longer, it's going to destabilize Iraq. The war will restart in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq will have an enormous opportunity to expand into Syria and then come back into Iraq. And occasionally I sort of mentioned this to diplomats, but they were all completely dismissive of it. And they were dismissive of some Iraqi ministers and so forth when they said this, though it should have been something pretty obvious. They only really came across in about 2015. Even after Mosul, they didn't really take it on board until, sort of refugees started surging into Europe and ISIS started murdering people in central Paris. So I think that, the ignorance of governments, because they get a lot of their information from watching television and newspapers as well, is also a sort of toxic element in the situation. There's the study, why did this happen in Iraq? Because the Americans withdrew. Well, no, it didn't happen that. It happened because what happened in Syria, If all these sort of skewed reporting and partisan journalism and propaganda, a big sort of dangerous element of it is that the guys who are pumping it out believe it. Look at Libya, I don't think the guys who did that, overthrew Gaddafi, realize that Libya was then going to descend into anarchy, that, there would be floods of migrants across the Mediterranean, which they didn't want, that everything would be destroyed there, because they believed all this stuff that they were putting out. So that's another sort of negative aspect of that. It's particularly surprising, sort of end of 2012-13, it's quite difficult to say, Assad's, going to stay in power. It's fairly obvious for the following reasons, but quite difficult to get a hearing at that time. I'm not conscious of actually being a serious, I suppose I was attacked a bit, but, what struck me at that time was one was continually saying things that seemed pretty obvious and not getting a hearing or having an impact. Yeah. Again, early 2014 in Iraq, ISIS, Daesh took Fallujah. Fallujah is about 20, 30 miles west of Baghdad, and the Iraqi army couldn't get them out for 6 months. This means the Iraqi army is very weak. ISIS is very strong, something ISIS is going to, expand. But again, and then, of course, they took Mosul. But until that happened, it's very difficult to persuade people that this was about to explode, that these things are about to happen.
Yeah, I think this might be a good place to wrap up. Patrick, first of all, I hope that your work is ultimately vindicated, since you've been stating the obvious for years and no one has taken any accountability for the completely bogus analysis they've been pushing. For example, that Assad has to be removed in order to defeat ISIS, But I guess I wonder if you can, give us, just in closing, kind of your projection for the future of Syria as the war moves into a different phase, with the U.S. attempting to occupy at least 25% of the country, Syria attempting to take control of the north, and Russia retrenching its position along with the Iranian ally of the Syrian government.
Patrick, you wrote an article in The Independent precisely about this, called "The Syrian War Could Still Be Raging in 4 Years' Time." And specifically, you talk about the potential new war emerging between Kurdish forces and Turkey. So in addition to answering what Max asked, which is more general, do you think that that now that the war has largely wound down, ISIS is militarily defeated for the most part, although there are still remnants of it. Idlib is the last remaining rebel-held province. So it looks like the civil war itself within the majority of Syria is winding down, but in the northern part of the country, we're seeing this new phase. How do you see that panning out?
Well, I think that's why I think, and I was quoting the sort of top Syrian Kurdish leader in saying that, but I sort of agree with him. It's called Alda Khalil. I sort of agree with him because, you have rivalry between the US and Russia. I think that I don't think the US is going to pull out of Syria. So, it's going to be divided into three. But, where is that border going to be between these three areas? We don't know. Certainly Assad wants to take over the whole of Syria. He's not just going to give up. The Turks also unclear. They want to get rid of the whole sort of Syrian Kurdish area, if they could think of a way of doing it. So this is going to fuel the war going on. Then the US, it has a couple of thousand troops on the ground. It has allied to the Kurds. But its main weapon is the Air Force. So what if the Turks attack? Is it going to use the Air Force against them? So its only sort of real weapon is a sort of tremendous hammer. So I think all these things will go on fueling it. The only thing that could really stop it would be a sort of an agreement between the heaviest hitters, notably Russia and the US. But that doesn't look like happening. So, poor Syria remains the arena in which local, regional, and international disputes are fought out. Parts of the country will get more stable, like Damascus, Aleppo, but in other places, I think the war will go on.
And we haven't even mentioned Israel yet. But Patrick, I really want to thank you for coming on with us. This has been extremely enlightening and somewhat therapeutic for me. So I hope we can do it again at some point.
Sure. No, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us and specifically just sharing, all of these experiences, because one of the reasons I respect your work is not just because you really do believe in searching for truth and you don't believe in just picking a side and fighting for that side. But what's more incredible is most journalists these days just spend their time in Beirut. Middle East reporters, that is. They spend their time in Beirut and Istanbul. What's great is, you're still going to the field and reporting from many of these conflict zones, and that's incredibly admirable.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, it's the only way of sort of doing this is actually sort of eyewitness reporting. You can, as we were saying, something as intricate and complicated as this, to do it long distance, is kind of absurd, just as absurd if one was trying to report the US election, based in Zagreb or something, it just obviously doesn't work. And it doesn't work in Syria either.
Great. Well, thank you.
We'll be following you closely.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Moderate Rebels. As always, we will have show notes for our episode, and our website is moderaterebelsradio.com. If you would like to support what we're doing here at Moderate Rebels, and if you'd like to gain access to exclusive content, please consider subscribing at our Patreon page. That is patreon.com/moderaterebels. And of course, we're on social media. We're on Twitter at Moderate Radio, and we're on Facebook at Moderate Rebels Radio. Thanks for listening.